an IRS special agent called Kevin Moss was in charge of that leg of the investigation. Now, the reason the IRS was involved in an investigation about drugs is that part of the purview of the IRS is money laundering. And as you know, drugs and money laundering go hand in hand. So that part of the investigation focused on the fact that $1.8 million worth of proceeds of heroin trafficking was found in accounts that belonged to a fellow by the name of Bola Tinubu. So that was the IRS leg of the investigation. So it was basically what you would call an indictment that basically drew a straight line that this is where these funds originated from. This is the heroin distribution organization. These are the main characters. So a guy by the name of Moise Akonde and his accomplices, Lee Andrew Edwards, and the other guy, Agbele, who later became a political operator under Iowa in the States. And these are the main characters in this heroin trafficking operation. This is the account that these monies were deposited into. And then these are the relationships between these heroin traffickers and the people who control these accounts. So Bola Tinubu was identified. Bola Tinubu's wife, Remi Tinubu, was also identified as someone who ran a joint account with a wife of one of these heroin traffickers. And Lee Andrew Edwards, who was sort of the African American sort of spearhead of the gang, the sort of retail end of the gang, he actually ended up dying in prison in the year 2004. The investigation was actually primarily about him, but it dragged in all these other people. So the story that I published in 2022 focused on that, as well as some other financial misdemeanors and potential money laundering, potential instances of money laundering that I was able to dig up with my own research. Now, after publishing that story, there's a guy called Aaron Greenspan. He's the founder of a website called Plainsight.org. Now, Plainsight is a website that deals primarily with legal disclosure. So the goal of Plainsight is that things that should be on public record should be publicly available and readily so. So U.S. federal case records, as quickly as they can be obtained from PACER, which is the U.S. Government database, they're posted on Plainsight. So the Plainsight section regarding Bola Tinubu started receiving a lot of traffic after I published that story. And the owner of Plainsight realized that my story was where this traffic was coming from. So he reached out to me. And we came up with a collaboration, an idea for a collaboration that, okay, now this story was based primarily on an IRS investigation. Now it was a federal drug investigation. So definitely the FBI and the DEA would also have been involved, because that's how federal investigations work. You have different government agencies collaborating on a single investigation. So we're going to get the records of the FBI and the DEA by sending in a Freedom of Information request. So that was done in, I believe that was November 2022, the first time we sent out an FOIA to these government agencies. This FOIA was turned down, it was denied, and the exemptions that were claimed to justify turning down the FOIA cited individual privacy concerns, privacy exemptions, as well as national security exemptions, whatever that might mean. So we appealed. I believe this was in March 2023. We appealed the refusal of the FOIAs. The appeal was turned down. So then we took it to court, which is the last option that you have. You can actually sue government agencies in the US for turning down your FOIA request, and then a judge has to hear the case. Now, normally what would happen is if you're taking it to court, you have to pay for a lawyer, and it's a very expensive process. But because Aaron has a lot of expertise in FOIA litigation specifically, even though he's not a lawyer, because he has done this for so many years, so having him was as good as having a lawyer. So we were actually able to go through this without spending, stupid money on a lawyer. So all I ended up spending money on was like filing costs for the lawsuit. So $80 here, $400 there, which is not to say that it was cheap, but it was a lot less expensive than it would have been for me if I had to pay for a US lawyer. So from May 2023 onwards, which was when the case kicked off in earnest, Aaron and I have been working. So Aaron's name appears on the case file. So it's Greenspan versus EU, USA, FBI, CIA, like that. My name doesn't appear on the case because obviously he's a US citizen and a US resident. So it was more expedient for his name to appear on the document. So we've been doing this jointly since 2023. In September 2023, we then got something called a joint status report from these 6 government agencies. And they said that, okay, we're going to release these files. The FBI specifically said we're going to release the files that we have identified as relevant to your request. And we've identified 2,500 pages. So they first identified about 70,000 pages, but then we requested that they shrink down the number of pages to the most relevant ones, to pages that had specifically to do with Bola Tinubu, with Moise Adegboyega, with Remi Tinubu, with Chief K.O. Tinubu, and with other members of the Tinubu family, and things relating to the heroin distribution case specifically. So that number shrank down to 2,500. So we were then told that these 2,500 pages of documents will be released at the rate of about 500 a month over 5 months. And that the release will start from the end of October 2023, which actually did happen. However, instead of getting 500 pages every month, it was closer to about 300. So in every release, at least 200 pages were basically missing. They were basically redacted. There was no mention whatsoever of Tinubu's name specifically in the pages that were released to the public. All mention of his name was removed. So those were the redactions. So by February 2024, when the release of those files ended, we then filed an appeal. And the appeal was specifically regarding the redaction, that we wanted the redactions taken out. So as not to waste our time and everybody's time, we then asked for something called a summary judgment. Now, what a summary judgment is that the judge, instead of watching all of us go back and forth, making arguments back and forth, which can take years, the judge makes a final decision. The judge examines the merits of both arguments and makes a final decision that should these redactions be lifted or not.
Okay.
Are these exemptions valid or not? Right. So the arguments that the DEA and the FBI made in the court filings were that the exemptions are valid because even though Bola Tinubu is a public official and Nigerians have a right to know what their public officials, that Nigerians have a right to know what their government is up to, that doesn't extend to knowing what specific public officials might have been up to, which I thought was an incredible argument to make, because certainly you wouldn't make that argument if it was an American public official. But I guess Black lives really don't matter to some people apparently. So obviously we pushed back on that, and we've been going back and forth since I think November last year. So it was Tuesday last week that the judge, Beryl Howell, delivered this ruling, her summary judgment, and the summary judgment was that the reasons being given for these exemptions are completely nonsensical, that they make no sense, that these exemptions are not valid. So basically the rationale behind these reductions has mixed. So they have to go back and produce those documents again, and this time using the knowledge that those exemptions are not valid. So basically all the missing pages have to be put in this time around. So the same files are going to be released, but with those missing pages this time around. The pages that make mention of Tinubu's name. So that's what the judgment is.
I'm curious.